The candles were the first thing Vivian Marsh noticed when the doors of the church opened, dozens of them lining the aisle in tall brass holders, their flames trembling as if the whole sanctuary were holding its breath with her. She stood at the threshold in a white gown that had taken 3 fittings to get right, lace sleeves cuffed at her wrists, the bodice structured enough to make her stand straighter than she felt. Her bouquet of white orchids trembled slightly in her grip, and she told herself it was nerves, ordinary wedding nerves, nothing more. 200 guests filled the pews. Somewhere near the front her mother dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Vivian exhaled once, fixed her eyes on the altar, and began to walk. At the altar stood Taeyong Choi, and even from this distance, she could see the particular stillness that had first drawn her to him 8 months ago, the way he stood like a man who had never once needed to fill silence with movement. His suit was black, cut close through the shoulders, a single pin at his lapel catching the light. His hands were folded in front of him, the same hands she had watched sign contracts and pour tea and once press flat against a car window to steady her when the city outside had felt too loud. She had learned to read those hands. She had not learned, apparently, to read the rest of him. She reached the altar. The priest opened his book. And Taeyong did not look at her the way a groom looks at a bride. He looked past her, toward the doors at the back of the church, and something in his jaw tightened in a way she had seen before only when negotiations went badly. "Before we begin," he said, and his voice carried through the church without effort, the way it always did, "there is something I need to say." The priest closed his book slowly. A murmur moved through the pews like wind through wheat. "I cannot marry this woman," Taeyong said. The words landed in Vivian's chest like a dropped glass, all sound and no warning. She did not move. She had learned, in her 28 years, that the body sometimes understood a disaster before the mind agreed to accept it, and hers had gone very still, very quiet, waiting for the rest of the sentence that would explain this away. It did not come. Instead, the doors at the back of the church opened again, and a woman walked in wearing red. She was young, younger than Vivian. Her black hair swept over one shoulder, her dress the color of a wound that had not yet closed. She walked down the aisle Vivian had just walked, past the same 200 guests, and stopped beside Taeyong as if she had rehearsed the distance 100 times. "This is Sumin," Taeyong said. "She will be my wife." Vivian heard her mother make a sound behind her, something between a gasp and a sob. She heard the priest say something she did not process. She heard, distantly, the particular silence of 200 people deciding not to breathe. What she did not hear, for several long seconds, was her own thoughts, because there was nothing in her mind but a white, ringing static, the sound of a life rearranging itself without her permission. She looked at Taeyong. He looked back at her, and for one instant, just one, something moved behind his eyes that was not triumph and was not cruelty. It looked almost like an apology. Then it was gone, replaced by the composed blankness she had once mistaken for depth. "You could have told me this before I put on the dress," she said. Her voice did not shake. She was proud of that, later, when she had time to be proud of anything. "I am telling you now," he said. She set the bouquet down on the altar rail, deliberately, the way she set down anything she intended never to pick up again. Then she turned and walked back down the aisle, past the pews of people who did not know where to look, past her mother's outstretched hand, out through the church doors, and into a Seoul afternoon that smelled of rain that had not yet fallen. She did not cry until she was 3 blocks away, and even then, she cried the way she did everything with control, with an end point already decided. What she did not know, standing on that street corner in a ruined wedding gown, was that within 6 hours, Taeyong Choi's empire would begin to come apart at the seams his new bride had been sent to cut, and that the only person who would understand what was happening quickly enough to stop it was the woman he had just humiliated in front of 200 witnesses. Vivian had come to Seoul 14 months earlier as a financial consultant for a firm that restructured failing companies, and Choi Holdings had been her 4th client, though she had not known at first what Choi Holdings truly was beneath its shipping contracts and real estate portfolios. She had learned the truth in pieces, the way one learns a language, by immersion rather than instruction, until one day the vocabulary of the organization made sense to her the way English once had, without her remembering the moment she had stopped translating it. She had been good at her job. She was good at most things she set her mind to, which was, she often thought, both her gift and her curse, because competence invited responsibility and responsibility rarely left room for softness. She had walked into Taeyong's office 9 months ago to explain, in blunt terms, that 3 of his lieutenants were bleeding money through a logistics company in Incheon, and instead of dismissing her the way powerful men often dismissed a woman who told them uncomfortable truths, he had listened. He had asked her to sit. He had asked her, when the meeting ended, to have dinner with him, not as a proposition but as a continuation of a conversation he did not want to end. She had known what he was. She was not naive, whatever her mother believed. She had known about the territory disputes, the debts collected in ways no bank ever collected them, the particular quiet that fell over a room when he entered it. She had told herself, more than once, that she was staying for reasons she could defend to herself in the mirror, and some of those reasons had even been true. But mostly she had stayed because he said her name, Vivian, in a way no one else did, slower, like he was tasting the shape of it, and because underneath the stillness there had been, she believed, something that trusted her. She had been wrong about the trust running both ways. That much was now undeniable. She checked into a hotel 3 streets from the church, still in the dress, because she owned nothing else in the small overnight bag she had packed for what was supposed to be a wedding night, and she sat on the edge of the bed and made herself breathe until the static in her head resolved into something closer to thought. Her phone had 41 missed calls, none from Taeyong. She was scrolling past them when a single message arrived from a number she did not recognize. Miss Marsh, you need to see this before you leave the country. Meet me at the address below in 1 hour. Come alone. This concerns the wire transfers you flagged in March. She stared at the message for a long time. The wire transfers from March had been a discrepancy she had raised with Taeyong's finance director and then, at his request, buried, because he had told her it was a family matter, something involving an uncle who skimmed and would be dealt with quietly. She had trusted that explanation. She was no longer certain she should have trusted any explanation that man had ever given her. She went. She told herself later it was foolish, that a woman who had just been humiliated in a church should have taken the first flight home and let the Choi organization implode without her, but curiosity had always been a stronger current in her than self-preservation, and there was, underneath the humiliation, a colder question she needed answered. What had she actually been part of? The address was a parking structure near the river, empty at this hour except for a black sedan idling on the 3rd level. A man stepped out when she approached, not one of Taeyong's usual lieutenants, but someone she recognized from the periphery of meetings, a logistics manager named Han Seo who had always struck her as too nervous for the work he did. The wire transfers were not a family matter, Han Seo said, without preamble. They were payments to Sumin's father. Her father runs the Beck organization, out of Busan. This wedding today was never a wedding. It was a handover. A handover of what? Of everything, Han Seo said. Taeyong signed control of the northern shipping routes to the Beck family 3 weeks ago, in exchange for his life. They have been planning to remove him since spring. The marriage was supposed to be the cover, a merger that looked legitimate on paper while they moved their people into every position that mattered. You were supposed to be gone by tonight. Nobody expected you to still be in the city. Vivian felt something in her chest go very cold and very clear, the way it did in negotiations when she finally understood the actual number behind the number she had been shown. Why are you telling me this? Because I liked working for him before this, Han Seo said. And because if the Beck family finishes what they started tonight, they will not stop with Taeyong. They will clean out everyone who knew the old structure. That includes people who consulted for him. That includes you. Somewhere above them, a car door closed. Han Seo's head snapped toward the sound, and in the half-second before he moved, Vivian saw genuine fear cross his face, the kind that did not perform for an audience.
Go, he said. Now.
She did not need to be told twice. She ran for the stairwell instead of the elevator, her heels loud against the concrete despite herself, and behind her she heard voices, 2 men, unhurried, the particular unhurried quality of people who believed no one was actually running from them. She reached the stairwell door and pulled it open just as a gunshot cracked through the parking structure, flat and enormous in the enclosed space, and she did not look back to see what had happened to Hana Seo because some animal part of her understood that looking back would cost her the half-second she needed to survive. She came out onto the street 2 levels down, breathless, the white dress catching on a metal railing and tearing at the hem, and she kept running until she reached a main road with people on it, with light, with the ordinary indifference of a city that did not know 2 rival organizations were currently rearranging the balance of power inside it. She had nowhere obvious to go. Her hotel was compromised the moment anyone thought to check her registered address. Her firm's sole office was closed for the night. She thought, absurdly, of calling her mother, and dismissed it in the same breath, because there was nothing her mother could do from 6,000 miles away except worry. She thought of Taeyong. She hated that she thought of him. She hated more that some traitorous, practical part of her mind recognized that whatever else was true, he was the one person in this city who would know exactly what Hana Seo's death meant and exactly how dangerous the next few hours were about to become. She had spent 9 months learning how his organization worked. She knew, for instance, that he kept a secondary residence in Songbukdong that was not listed under his name, a house his own people used only when something had gone catastrophically wrong.
She went there.
She told herself it was strategy, not sentiment, and mostly believed it. The house was a modernist structure of concrete and glass set behind a high wall, and when she reached the gate, a guard she did not recognize stepped out of the shadows with a weapon half raised before he saw her face and lowered it, confusion written plainly across his features, as if the abandoned bride was the last person he expected to arrive at this door. "He is inside," the guard said finally. "Go." She found Taeyong in a room with the lights off, standing at a window that looked out over a dark garden, his jacket gone, his tie loosened, a glass of something amber untouched on the table beside him. He turned when she entered, and whatever composure had carried him through the wedding disaster in the church had fractured somewhere in the last 3 hours, because for the first time since she had known him, he looked, briefly, like a man who did not know what to do next. "You should not be here," he said. "Hana Seo is dead," she said. "The Beck family shot him in a parking structure 20 minutes ago because he told me the truth about the wire transfers, about your marriage, about the routes you signed away." She heard her own voice shaking now, finally, the adrenaline giving way to something rawer. "You humiliated me in front of 200 people this morning, and it turns out you were selling your entire organization out from under yourself the whole time, and somehow I am the one who nearly got killed for knowing about it." Taeyong set down the glass. "The wedding was not what you think. Then tell me what it actually was." He was quiet for a long moment, and she watched him decide something. Watched the calculation move behind his eyes the way it did before he signed a contract he had already decided to break. 3 months ago, the Beck organization approached me with an offer. Marry Suman, transfer control of the northern routes as a dowry, and they would let me keep my life and a fraction of my territory. Refuse, and they would take everything by force within the year, starting with the people closest to me. I said yes because I thought I could manage the transition on my own terms. I did not expect them to move against my own people this quickly. I did not expect them to move against you. You let me stand at that altar not knowing any of this. If I had told you, they would have known you knew," he said. "There were people from the Beck organization in that church, Vivian, watching. If I had shown you any warmth at all this morning, any hint that you mattered to me, they would have understood exactly what leverage you represented, and you would have been dead before the reception." She stared at him, and something in her chest that had been screaming since the moment he said, "I cannot marry this woman," went suddenly, dangerously quiet. "You humiliated me on purpose. To protect me. I humiliated you because it was the only way to make them believe you meant nothing," he said. "I am not asking you to forgive it. I am telling you the truth, because you came to this house instead of the airport, and that means some part of you already suspected there was more to it than cruelty." She wanted to hate him cleanly, without complication, and he had just made that impossible, which she suspected was, in its own way, another kind of manipulation, one more calculated move in a man who did not seem to know how to move any other way. And yet, She had watched his face in the church. She had seen, for one instant, something that was not triumph. She believed, against every instinct that told her not to, that he was telling her the truth now.
What happens now? She said.
Now the Beck family believes they have already won, Taeyong said. They believe I signed away my routes, married their daughter, and will spend the next month pretending to be content while they finish dismantling what is left of my organization from the inside. What they do not know is that Hanesio was not the only person I have inside their structure, and they do not know that you are the only person alive who understands the financial architecture well enough to see exactly where they're vulnerable. You want me to help you take your empire back. I want you to survive the next 72 hours, he said. Whether you help me after that is your decision, not mine. I have taken enough decisions from you today. Something about the way he said it, flat and without performance, made her believe him more than any declaration would have. She thought of the parking structure, of the gunshot, of Hanesio's fear in the half-second before she ran. She thought of 200 guests watching her walk down an aisle toward a lie designed to keep her alive. She thought, finally, of the particular stillness in Taeyong's hands, and understood that whatever this man was, coward was not among his failures. I want the truth from now on, she said. All of it. Even when it is inconvenient. You will have it, he said, for as long as either of us survives long enough for it to matter. She did not sleep that night. Neither did he. They sat at a table in the dark house with a laptop between them, and she pulled apart the financial records she had once been asked to bury, tracing the wire transfers backward through 3 shell companies until she found what she had suspected from the beginning, that the Beck family's claim to the northern routes rested on a signature that had been forged 11 weeks before the wedding, before Taeyong had ever agreed to anything. They never had a legitimate claim, she said, turning a laptop toward him. They forged your signature on the transfer documents in June, then spent 3 months forcing you into a wedding that would make the forgery look like a voluntary handover after the fact. If you had refused the marriage, they would have produced these documents anyway and claimed you agreed months ago. Taeyong studied the screen for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression, the particular stillness she knew so well sharpening into something with an edge to it. They were never going to let me keep anything. The wedding was never a mercy. It was theater so that when they took everything, the rest of the organization would believe I had given it away willingly instead of having it stolen. Which means the moment you can prove the forgery, the entire justification for their move collapses. Can you prove it? I can prove it, she said, if you can get me access to the original contract archive before Sumin's people realize what I am doing. He looked at her across the table, and for the first time since the church, something that was not calculation moved openly across his face. You could leave. You could take what you know to the police, to a rival organization, to anyone, and let this become someone else's war. You have no reason to stay in mine. I have every reason, she said. They tried to kill me tonight for knowing the truth. I would rather be the reason they lose than the reason they think they won. He reached across the table then, not for the laptop, but for her hand, resting his fingers over hers with a deliberateness that felt entirely unlike the calculated stillness she had learned to expect from him. Then we do this together, and when it is finished, whatever you decide about me, you decide it as a free woman, not as someone I trapped in a church. Her fingers curled slightly beneath his, an answer she was not yet ready to say aloud, and outside the tall windows, the dark garden held its silence like it, too, understood something was beginning that would not be undone. The contract archive was housed in a records office in Jongno that Choi Holdings had used for 2 decades to store the paperwork no one wanted digitized, and getting Vivian inside without alerting the Beck family's people meant moving before sunrise, while the building's night staff still answered to Taeyong's remaining loyalists rather than the new arrangement no one outside the organization yet knew was already broken. She dressed in clothes borrowed from a closet in the Songbukdong house, dark trousers and a plain jacket, nothing that resembled the woman who had stood at an altar in white lace less than a day earlier, and Taeyong watched her change in the doorway without comment, though she noticed the particular way his gaze moved over her, careful, restrained, a man deliberately not allowing himself something he wanted. You do not have to come with me, she said. It is safer if you stay here and let your people move without you as a target. It is safer for the organization, he said. It is not safer for you, and I have already decided that matters more to me than it should. She did not have a response for that, so she said nothing, and they left the house together in the gray hour before dawn, moving through streets that still smelled of last night's rain. Two people who had been supposed to be married and were instead about to commit a small act of theft against the people who had tried to kill her. The records office was quiet, guarded by two men who nodded at Taeyong without surprise, as though his presence there before sunrise, hours after his own wedding collapsed into scandal, was simply one more Tuesday in a life built on discretion. Vivian moved through the archive with a particular focus she brought to any problem that had a solvable shape, pulling files, cross-referencing dates, until she found the original transfer contract buried in a folder mislabeled to discourage exactly this kind of search. She laid it beside a legitimate contract Taeyong had signed the previous year, and the difference, once she saw it, was unmistakable. Look at the pressure here, on the descender of the Y in your name. Your genuine signature is consistent across every document in this archive. This one is slower. Whoever forged it was careful, but they were copying, not writing, and copying always shows in the pressure points if you know where to look. Taeyong leaned over the table, close enough that she caught the note of cedar and something darker beneath it, the same scent that had, months ago, been the first thing she noticed about him in a boardroom full of men who smelled of nothing at all. You are certain? I have spent 14 months reading contracts for a living, she said. I am certain. Then we have what we need to expose them, he said, but exposing a forgery is not enough to stop the Beck family from finishing what they started. Evidence convinces people who are inclined to be convinced. It does not stop bullets. Then we need more than evidence, Vivian said. We need them to believe for a few more hours that they have already won, right up until the moment it is too late for them to react. Something in his expression shifted, approval and something warmer moving together behind his eyes. You are describing a trap. I am describing the only version of this, where I do not spend the rest of my life waiting for a car to slow down on the wrong street, she said. So yes, a trap. They spent the next several hours building it, and Vivian found, somewhere in the planning, that the fear which had chased her out of the parking structure the night before had transformed into something steadier, a cold and useful clarity she recognized from every difficult negotiation she had ever walked into. Taeyong's remaining loyalists were quietly recalled under the cover of ordinary business, men who had not yet declared for the Beck family because they had not yet been asked to choose. Soo-min, Vivian learned, was staying at a hotel near the river with two of her father's lieutenants, waiting for word that the transition had been finalized, unaware that the forged contract underpinning her father's claim was about to become the instrument of her family's undoing. There is something you should know about Soo-min, Taeyong said, late in the afternoon, when the plan was nearly assembled and exhaustion had begun to show at the edges of his composure.
She did not choose this either.
Her father arranged the marriage the same way he arranged everything else in her life, as a transaction. I do not say this to defend what happened in the church. I say it because when this is finished, I do not want you to mistake her for an enemy who chose to be one. Vivian considered this, surprised, not for the first time, by the shape of his mercy, how it appeared in unexpected places, quiet and unadvertised. That is not what I expected you to say. I have made my share of ruthless decisions, he said. I do not need to invent cruelty where it does not belong. That wound, she said carefully, watching his face. The one that makes you so certain about people who are trapped in transactions they did not choose. Where does it come from? He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer, and when he did, his voice had lost some of its usual precision, roughened at the edges by something old. Before I ran this organization, my older brother did. He trusted a woman he loved with information that should have stayed inside the family, because he believed love meant certainty, and she used it to hand him to a rival faction in exchange for her own family's survival. She did not want to betray him. She was given no better option, and he never blamed her for it, even at the end. I inherited the organization because of what happened to him. I inherited, too, the certainty that trust given without safeguards gets people killed, and that certainty is why I let you believe for one night that you meant nothing to me. I would rather you hate me and live than love me, and become the next woman a man like me got killed by trusting. Vivian felt something in her chest crack open, not from pity, which she suspected he would have refused, but from recognition, the particular ache of understanding exactly why a person had built the walls they had built. I am not her, she said. Whatever happened to your brother, I am not going to be the reason it happens to you. I know that now, he said. It took me longer to know it than it should have. Night fell over the city, and with it came the hour they had built the trap around, a meeting arranged under false pretenses at a private dining room in a hotel Taeyong's people still controlled, where Sumin's father, Baek Do-hyun, would come to formalize what he believed was the final transfer of the northern routes. Vivian stood in a side room with the forged contract and the genuine one, both prepared to be presented at exactly the moment Baek Do-hyun believed his victory was secured, and her hands, she noticed, were steady in a way they had not been standing at the altar the morning before. When this starts, Taeyong said, low, close enough that only she could hear him. You stay in this room until I come for you. Whatever happens in there, you do not come out until it is finished. I did not survive a parking structure last night to hide in a side room while you finish this alone, she said. I am not asking you to hide, he said. I am asking you to trust that I know what I am doing, the same way I am learning to trust that you know what you are doing with a stack of contracts. We are not the same kind of dangerous. Let me be the kind this room requires. She held his gaze for a long moment, and something passed between them that was not quite agreement and not quite surrender, closer to the particular trust that gets built only under circumstances neither party would have chosen. If it goes wrong, she said, I am not staying in this room. I would expect nothing less, he said, and for the first time since the church, something that was almost a smile moved across his face, brief and unguarded, gone before she could be certain she had seen it at all. The meeting began on schedule. Baek Do-hyun arrived with Sumin at his side and 2 lieutenants behind him, settling into the private dining room with the particular ease of a man who believed the war was already won, and Taeyong met him with a composure so complete that Vivian, watching through a gap in the door, understood for the first time the full weight of what it meant to be a man who had learned to survive by never once showing his hand before he intended to play it. You have brought the final documents, Baek Do-hyun said. I have brought something better, Taeyong said, and set the folder on the table between them, open to the forged contract laid beside the genuine one. I have brought proof that the signature you built your claim on was never mine. The temperature in the room changed instantly, the way it always did when a plan collapsed faster than the person who built it could adjust to the collapse. Baek Do-hyun's composure did not break entirely, but Vivian, watching from the doorway now, saw the specific tightening at the corner of his mouth that told her everything she needed to know. He had not expected this. No one had told him the forgery could be traced. This is not the conversation you think it is, Baek Do-hyun said. The routes are already transferred. My people are already in place. A piece of paper does not undo 3 weeks of operational control. It does when the paper is what a court and every organization who respects the old rules will recognize as fraud, Taeyong said. You did not seize my routes. You stole them, and every ally who backed your claim did so believing it was legitimate. When they learn it was not, and they will learn it within the hour because I have already told them, you will not have allies. You will have witnesses to a forgery, standing in a room with the man who committed it. Baek Do-hyun's hand moved, slow and deliberate, toward the inside of his jacket, and in the doorway Vivian's whole body went cold with a clarity sharper than anything she had felt in the parking structure the night before, because she understood, watching the gesture unfold, exactly what it meant and exactly how little time existed to stop it. She stepped through the door before she had fully decided to move. There is one more thing you should see, she said, her voice carrying into the room with a steadiness she did not entirely feel, and every head turned toward her, including Taeyong's, whose expression flickered for exactly 1 instant with something between alarm and helpless respect. The forgery was not the only evidence I found in that archive. I also found records showing your organization has been skimming from the shipping insurance claims on every route you have controlled for the last 6 years. Your own people do not know about that yet, but I imagine they would find it interesting, given how much of it never made its way to them. Baek Do-hyun's hand stopped moving toward his jacket. "You are bluffing," he said, but his voice had lost its certainty, and Vivian watched the calculation move behind his eyes the way it moved behind every powerful man's eyes when he realized the ground beneath him was not as solid as he had believed. "I have spent 14 months reading financial records for a living," she said. "I do not bluff with numbers. I have copies of everything, held with people who have instructions to release them the moment anything happens to either of us tonight. You can shoot us both in this room, but the routes will still not be yours, and your own organization will know exactly what kind of man has been leading them, which I imagine is a more permanent problem than the one you came here to solve." The room held its breath. Vivian felt Taeyong's presence beside her now, close, steady, not moving to protect her because he understood. She realized that she had not asked to be protected, only to be heard, and for the first time in the entire encounter, Baek Do-hyun looked at her the way he had not bothered to look at her before, as an equal, a person capable of ending him as thoroughly as any weapon could. "What do you want?" he said finally. "I want the forged contract acknowledged as void, in front of the witnesses who backed your claim," Taeyong said. "I want my routes returned, and I want your organization to understand that this territory was never yours to take. In exchange, the insurance records stay where they are, unreleased, as long as you and your people withdraw from my territory tonight and do not return." Baek Do-hyun's jaw worked for a long moment, calculating, and Vivian understood. She was watching a man weigh his pride against his survival and find, as most men eventually did, that survival one. "The routes are yours," he said finally. "The marriage arrangement is dissolved." Beside him, Sumin let out a breath that sounded, to Vivian's ear, less like disappointment and more like relief, and for one unguarded moment the two women looked at each other across the room, two people who had both been used as instruments in a war neither of them had started, and something like understanding passed between them, wordless and complete. It was not until the room had emptied, until Baek Do-hyun and his lieutenants had gone, and the immediate danger had drained out of the air like water finding a lower point, that Vivian felt her hands begin to shake, the delayed reaction of a body that had held itself together for exactly as long as it needed to, and no longer. Taeyong caught her hands before the shaking became visible to anyone but him, folding them between his own, and she felt, for the first time since the church, the particular warmth of him without calculation behind it, without a room full of enemies watching to see what the gesture would mean. "You should not have come into that room," he said, but there was no real reprimand in it, only something rawer underneath. "You would have died in that room," she said. "I was not going to let that happen because you decided, alone, that protecting me meant leaving me in the dark. I told you. I want the truth from now on, and I want to be standing beside you when it matters, not hidden away where it is convenient." "I am beginning to understand," he said, "that you are not a woman who can be protected the way I protect most things. You do not want to be shielded. You want to be trusted." "Yes," she said. "That." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face, the stillness she had once mistaken for coldness, resolved into something she finally understood as its opposite, a man who had learned, the hard way, that stillness was not the absence of feeling but the discipline of a person who felt too much and had trained himself not to show it, until now, until her, when he seemed to have run out of reasons to keep training himself at all. "I told a church full of people this morning that I could not marry you," he said. "I have never regretted a lie more thoroughly in my life." "Then do not make it a lie for much longer," she said, and something in her own voice surprised her, a certainty she had not planned to feel this soon, or perhaps had felt for longer than she was willing to admit, buried under the practical armor she wore into every negotiation, including, apparently, the negotiations of her own heart. He kissed her then, in the quiet ruin of a room that had nearly become a battlefield, and it was nothing like the wedding that had been staged for an audience that morning, nothing performed, nothing calculated, only the particular honesty of two people who had spent a single, impossible day discovering exactly what they were willing to survive for each other. The weeks that followed were not simple. An empire does not right itself in a night, and Taeyong spent the better part of a month rebuilding alliances that had wavered during the crisis, reassuring lieutenants who had watched their organization nearly fall to a forged signature and a marriage staged as theater. Vivian stayed through all of it, not as a consultant this time, but as something the organization had no established word for, a woman who sat in on meetings where numbers mattered and said what she saw plainly, who Taeyong deferred to on matters of finance the way he deferred to no one else, and who slowly, without ceremony, became as fixed a presence in that world as the man at its center. She thought, sometimes, about the woman in the red dress and what had become of her. She learned, eventually, through channels that moved information the way water moved through the city's older pipes, slow and indirect, that Sumin had left her father's organization entirely within weeks of that night, had taken a name that was not Beck and a life that was not arranged by anyone but herself, and Vivian found, when she heard it, that she was glad. In the specific way one is glad for a stranger who is never truly an enemy, only another woman handed a role she had not chosen. There was no second wedding in a church full of witnesses, no white dress replaced by another. Vivian had decided, somewhere in the weeks after the forged contract and the trap and the kiss in a room that still smelled faintly of gunmetal and cedar, that she did not need an audience to know what she had chosen. She chose it instead in smaller ways, in staying when leaving would have been easier, in learning the particular rhythms of a world she had once only consulted for and now, in some undeniable way, belonged to, not because Taeyong had claimed her, but because she had claimed herself, deliberately, with her eyes fully open to every danger the choice carried. On a quiet evening months later, standing at the same window in the Songbukdong house where she had found him the night everything nearly ended, Vivian watched the garden below settle into darkness, and Taeyong came to stand beside her the way he always did now, without ceremony, without calculation, simply present. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "Any of it? The church? The danger? Staying?" She considered the question honestly, the way she considered everything, and found the answer had been true for longer than she had allowed herself to admit. "I regret the wedding gown," she said. "It never did survive that stairwell.
But no,
I do not regret staying. I did not stay because you needed saving. I stayed because when it mattered, we saved each other, and I have never trusted anything more than the version of myself that walked into that room instead of hiding from it." He said her name then, the way he always had, slower than anyone else said it, like he was still, after everything, learning the exact shape of it, and outside the window the garden held its quiet the way it had the night this all began, except now the silence between them was not the aftermath of a disaster. It was simply theirs, chosen, unhurried, and entirely, finally honest. If you have made it this far into the story, you already know what it feels like to watch someone choose their own strength over everything the world tried to make them settle for, and if that resonated with you, make sure you are subscribed for more stories exactly like this one, because there are many more women in this world who refuse to be anyone's quiet tragedy, and you will not want to miss where they go next. Drop a comment and tell me the exact moment in this story where you knew Vivian was not going to be anybody's victim. Like this video if you want more dark romance like this one, and I will see you in the next story.